Every story in Torah is a heavenly message. Not a bit of gossip or local news, in Mesopotamia or something. Hey, how are things in Mesopotamia? Every story in Torah is a divine revelation. God had to come down to Mount Sinai and tell us that story. And have Moshe write it down forever, for all time to come. So, you get your first impression of the story, stop and think. Where's the godliness? My impression can't be the whole story. So let's take a look at the story of the binding of Isaac, Akedah Yitzchak. First of all, it's very interesting that it is called the binding of Isaac. Shouldn't it be called the test of Abraham? It's not about Isaac, the story is about Abraham. This is showing the greatness of Avraham. Why do we call it Akedah Yitzchak? That's got to tell you something. So let's take a look at the story. Here's how it reads. God tested Abraham, and he called to him and he said, take your son, your only son, your beloved son, Yitzchak, and bring him up as a sacrifice on the mountain that I will show you. He gets up early in the morning, and he goes off to do what God asked. In the last moment, he's already got Yitzchak on the altar, and he's about to sacrifice him, and the angel comes and says, don't do it. Because now it is known, you have now revealed how God-fearing you are, and that's all that needed to happen. Just testing. What feeling you come away with from that story? Well, first of all, poor Avraham. What did God put him through that for? Just testing. And then poor Yitzchak. He was 37 years old. He was not naive. He must have known, at least at some point in the event, he must have known that that's what was going to be happening. Did he cooperate? Did he resist? Was he part of that test? So, first of all, if God is testing Avraham, why involve Yitzchak? I mean, this must have been quite a traumatic experience for Yitzchak. Why involve him? Say, well, God needed to test Avraham, so Yitzchak had to be... No. Nobody is a victim of somebody else's test. And what does testing mean? What is that? Seems so cruel and unnecessary. Did God not know how devoted Avraham was? Did he not know that Avraham would obey whatever he tells him? He had to test him to find out. We're talking about God. So if you just read the story, you walk away thinking, wow, what's with Avraham? He doesn't even plead for Yitzchak's life. He pleads for the evil people of Sodom. He doesn't plead for Yitzchak. What did Yitzchak do? He was a good boy. Okay. So let's look at the rest of the story. Firstly, in those days, sacrificing your children was common because it was believed, with some justification, that being on earth, being human, was not the most fun thing to do. And if you could get to heaven, that would be better. So they believed in human sacrifices. They didn't sacrifice the worst kid on the block. This was not euthanasia. They sacrificed the best, the firstborn, the most innocent. Because sacrificing a child meant send the child back to heaven. And that was seen as a blessing. In fact, the other children who were not chosen to be the sacrifice must have felt a little insulted. Am I not good enough? How does God impress on the world that human sacrifice is a terrible idea? So look at the drama that God used to make that point. He tested Avraham, meaning to say, he didn't tell him up front what was going to happen. Not because he needed to prove something or to find out how devoted Avraham really was. Not at all. He knew how devoted he was, but he needed to make this point. And there was no event at Sinai going to happen for another hundreds of years, 400 years. So how is he going to make this statement dramatically? So he tells Avraham, go ahead. Yitzchak is wonderful. He deserves to come back to heaven. And of course, Avraham goes to do it. And then God says, don't you dare do that. Don't even touch your kid. Human sacrifices? Totally unacceptable. Boy, that made an impression, both on Avraham and on Yitzchak. And since they were the moral teachers of the world at that time, the word got out. No human sacrifices. After that, anyone who did perform a human sacrifice of any nation in the world was held responsible and punishable, because it was well known that that is idolatry. It's not God's way of thinking. So that's just the technical, historical context. So why didn't Avraham plead for Yitzchak? What, plead that he shouldn't go to heaven? It's not like the people of Sodom. They were being punished and destroyed. They were not going to heaven. Yitzchak was going straight to heaven. What was he going to argue about? In fact, maybe Avraham had this little thought about, how come not me? I don't get to go to heaven? But let's go a little deeper than that. In order to reveal the godliness that Avraham embodied, you had to see something greater, something more divine than a very nice personality. Avraham was well known for being a wonderful guy, very hospitable. In fact, when he was recovering from his circumcision at 99 years old, what bothered him was that no guests were coming. So he sat by the door hoping somebody would come by and need a little help and need some food. So God sent 3 angels to appear as human beings so that Avraham could practice his kindness. So everybody knew Avraham to be a man of kindness, the epitome of kindness, the embodiment of kindness. And so he served God out of kindness. That didn't really reveal the godliness of it, because good is good, it's not godly. So everybody knew him as a good guy. But how was his godliness going to be revealed? So God asks him to do something that is diametrically opposed to the nature of kindness. Sacrifice your son. When Avraham was ready to do that, which, in human terms, that would be so uncharacteristic of him. That would be so out of his norm, out of his personality, out of his values, out of his comfort zone. If he could do that with the same devotion, with the same enthusiasm that he did kindness, then we know that his kindness is a divine kindness. And when necessary for divine purposes, he can be the opposite of kind as well. So that tells us something about godliness in the human being. A very, very good person is not a godly person. Just happens to be of the finer type. A superior human being, but a human being. God wanted to reveal to the world that Avraham was more than just a nice guy. And that when you devote yourself to God, you transcend your personality, your characteristics. The first time God spoke to Avraham, what was the first thing he said to him? He said, leave your birthplace, leave your home, leave your father's house. What does that tell you? Transcend yourself. You're a great person. He was 75 years old when God spoke to him for the first time, and he was already a great person. But he was a person. So now God comes to him and says, you got to be more than that. So leave your nature, your birth habits, your father's influence, the nurturing that you got. Transcend it all and be godly. So the ultimate expression of that was when Avraham showed an enthusiasm for anything that God would expect of him, whether it fit his personality or not. More than that, whether it fit his philosophy or not. I think it's safe to say that Avraham was not in favor of human sacrifices. Kindest man in the world would not be into human sacrifices. So when Avraham was ready to perform that mitzvah, that commandment, it was because his personality imposed no limits on his devotion to God. So we have a very important lesson here. Most people think that you have to be a good human being, right? Let's start at the beginning. First, you got to be a real mensch. You got to be a real decent, upstanding, get your head on right, have it all figured out. Then you can serve God if you believe in it or want. But you got to be a mensch. So if God comes along and tells you something that goes against your beliefs, against your values, you should protest. Here's an important principle that you may not hear anywhere else. When Avraham protested, defended the evil, wicked people of Sodom, we get the impression, and people actually speak of it this way, even some teachers, Avraham was a decent guy. And he was upset that God wasn't being decent enough. Some rabbis even suggest that that is the essence of Judaism. The essence of Judaism is to hold God responsible when he is misbehaving. How do we know he's misbehaving? Because we don't agree with what he's saying. Really. That's terribly, terribly wrong-minded. We are not more moral than God, and we don't preach to Him. That's absurd. So why did Avraham protest? The rest of the story? God comes to Avraham and says, I'm going to destroy the people of Sodom because they are exceedingly evil. And Avraham must have thought, why are you telling me this? Do your thing. You're God. You don't need my permission. Why did God tell Avraham that he's going to destroy the city of Sodom? Avraham took that as a divine message. God is telling me this so that I would defend them to the best of my ability, so that their guilty verdict would be clear, due process and all of that. In other words, Avraham argued because he knew that that's what God expected of him. That makes it much greater. Every time we protest, why do the righteous suffer? Why was there a Holocaust? Are we justified in questioning God's justice? We're not questioning. We are doing exactly what God expects us to do and wants us to do. And that is, if we don't see the justice, demand to see the justice. It's not enough to believe that God knows what He's doing. How do you live with what you think is evil? Just get used to it? Get jaded? Suffer silently? What are you supposed to do with that? Yes, I believe that God knows what He's doing. I don't see the justice. So there's like a little catch-22 here. If I let it go, I'm becoming insensitive and callous. If I don't let it go, I'm a heretic. How does this work? Am I allowed to complain? No, you're not allowed to complain. You're obligated to complain because you're not supposed to become callous and you're not supposed to become comfortable with what looks like injustice or even pain. You should not be getting comfortable with people's pain, even if it's just. Like the Baal Shem Tov, before he would slaughter a chicken to make it kosher, he would wet the stone by sharpening the knife. He would wet the stone with his tears. So sad that the world works this way, that to feed a human, an animal needs to die. So yes, it's justified. But no pain? Doesn't bother you? That's why the ritual slaughterers in Jewish tradition had to be more sensitive, more pious than the rabbi of the city, because he could so easily become callous. Okay, so the rest of the story, take it a step further. It was a test. Torah says it was a test. What was the test for Avraham? What was the difficulty? Parting with his son? Yeah. Waited a long time for that son. But there's something even more. More of a test. And that is, God told him that he would have grandchildren, many, many grandchildren from Yitzchak, the Jewish people. Now God says, sacrifice Yitzchak. And he's not married yet. Is that not confusing? Not confusing to a human being. God's message. God tells him he's going to have grandchildren from Yitzchak, and then God tells him to sacrifice him before he's married. So it's not that we expected Avraham to refuse, to resist, to argue against it. Didn't expect that at all. Avraham was a truly devoted servant of God, and what God said would not be questioned at all. But God is contradicting himself. So even without any selfish thoughts, I want my son, I want my future, whatever it is, even without that, as selfless as Avraham was he not confused? How did he handle this contradiction? Here we have a lesson on what it means to have faith. It was Avraham's faith that was being tested, not his selflessness. What was he thinking as he went to sacrifice his son? Now, could be, if he was human, merely human, he was thinking, I don't know, God promised me grandchildren, but I guess not. Not going to happen. So why did he promise me? I don't know. That would have been a human, almost unavoidable conclusion. Not going to have grandchildren. So what am I going to do with God's promise of grandchildren? What can I do? But that's not what he thought. He went to sacrifice Yitzchak, knowing that he is going to have grandchildren from Yitzchak. How is that going to work? That was not his problem. If God says you're going to have grandchildren from Yitzchak, and God says sacrifice Yitzchak, both will come true. How? I don't need to figure that out. God will make it happen. You see, that's what faith means. Faith means that you trust in what is supposed to happen, even when it looks completely, naturally impossible. Impossible. So imagine if Avraham thought the other way. So I guess I won't have children. Do you see how nature dictates his thinking? I mean, nature is pretty awesome, but it's not God. So his thinking would have been, if you sacrifice your son, you're not going to have grandchildren. That's one of the laws of nature. So if he had come away thinking that, it would have shown that he is a human being, but one of the better, nicer human beings. His faith was such that as he was going to sacrifice Yitzchak, he was looking forward to the grandchildren. But how is that possible? Well, you're talking about God. God runs the world, not the laws of nature. It probably helped that the birth of Yitzchak was a miracle in the first place. This whole thing is miraculous. Why stop now? There was no way Yitzchak could have been born. But he was. There's no way you can have children from a child, from your grandchildren, from a child who's no longer alive. But who's to say what God can't do? That's real faith. That's real greatness. One final thought. I'm always curious about how would, Joshua was Moshe's student. What did he think of Moshe? It's fascinating to know. What do very holy people think about very holy people? We have no idea. We can't imagine what it is. Aaron was very holy. Miriam was very holy, Moshe's brother and sister, and they criticized Moshe. And God was upset. Their criticism was, we're all holy. Why is Moshe different? Why does he act different? And God came to them and said, don't start up with Moshe. He is different. So it's fascinating to think, how do very holy people look at very holy people? What do they see? What are they impressed with? And so on. The previous Rebbe once, I think I read it or heard it, but the previous Rebbe made this observation. The great thing about Avraham was that when God said, sacrifice your son, he didn't ask whether he heard correctly. You imagine God comes to you and says, sacrifice your son. He's like, did you say what I think you just said? Just checking. Yeah, fine, I'll do it. I just want to make sure that that's what you said. In other words, how clear, how unmistakable was God's voice when he spoke to Avraham. That's a degree of prophecy. Many prophets received their prophecy in a vision that they had to interpret. Not the greatest prophecy. When they interpreted it correctly, it was recorded in the Torah. God approved. Say, yeah, you got that right. To one prophet, God said, what do you see? He described what he saw, and God said, you see well. You got it right. But with Avraham, he didn't even have to ask. Can you repeat that? Let me see. Did I get this right? You said, sacrifice my son? He didn't have to do that. In other words, he didn't doubt his own perception. Now that is a very godly person. Shalom Aleichem. How are you? I do a lot of talking, a lot of Zooming, many classes, many subjects, but that's all formal stuff. Hopefully good stuff, but formal. We also have a Wednesday night meeting that's more informal and kind of Hamish. If you want to join us for that kind of an event, interactive, time for questions and so on. If you want to join us for this side of conversation, click on the link below and join us every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock. Well, maybe not every Wednesday night, but we try to make it every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock, a more informal chat, which can be more enjoyable at times than the formal stuff. So check it out. Click on the link and join us. Try it. You'll like it.